Thank you, Joanna. I always love to hear Joanna sing. I was excited to see her name on the bulletin, and even more excited that she was singing the song that my mother used to always sing for special music. So I'd like to set one thing straight right off the bat. I am not Pastor Diego Rodriguez, as Ron mentioned, as it says in your bulletins. I only wish I were as young and handsome as he is. But today, you'll have to settle for older and more experienced. Most of you know me, but if you don't, my name is Mark Mashburn, and my wife Donna, who's sitting out there, those two cute silver-haired ladies, she's one of them. We've been longtime members here at Newmarket until a couple of years ago, when we left to start your church plant, Valley Fellowship. But we love an excuse to come back now and then to visit our friends and family here at Newmarket. We were given an excuse yesterday when Buzz called me and said, Pastor Diego is under the weather. Could you maybe fill in for him? And I'm thinking, tomorrow? But you know, when the Lord calls, I think you have to say yes, right? So I ask for your indulgence this morning as I deliver the message that God has given to me. So the title of today's message is The Healing Touch of Jesus. And just a few weeks back, I thought that just maybe I had obtained this ability to have the healing touch of Jesus. Let me tell you the story. I think most of you know that we live on a small farm in Mount Jackson, Virginia, just up the road. And we have lots of animals. We've got horses, we've got goats, we've got bunnies, we've got cats and dogs. And we have chickens. We have a lot of chickens. We have big chickens and little chickens. But the oldest of our chickens is a little red banty rooster by the name of Rusty. No offense, Rusty. Rusty is as old as Methuselah. This rooster was at our property before we moved there almost 7 years ago. And Rusty just keeps on going, it seems like. Well, if you recall, in February, we had a really cold spell that came about, and we were having temperatures like down to 0 degrees at night. And poor old Rusty, he just couldn't handle that kind of cold temperature, I don't think. And one morning, Donna had come in from feeding, and she said, Mark, I have some really sad news for you. I said, what's sad? And she said, Rusty's dying. I thought, Rusty's dying? What do you mean? And I was really upset to hear about poor Rusty the rooster was dying. And she said, yeah, Mama has him in her mud room to have him be warm and so he can die comfortably in there. Now, if you don't know it, Mom and Daddy live in a little cottage right by our house on the same property. So it's not far away at all. And I felt so bad. I have to go there and see Rusty. So I went over to the cottage, into the mudroom, and sure enough, he was in this little cage. And poor Rusty, it just looked so sad. He was laying on his side with his little head down. His eyes were barely open. I might get emotional telling this story. And so he was moving a little bit, and it was just me and him in the room, and I thought it'd be a good chance to tell him my goodbyes, you know. And so, you know, what do you say to a rooster when he's dying? But I said, you've been a good rooster, and I'm going to miss you. And it's kind of giving him his last rites, you know. And so then I reached in, and I gently petted his head, and I told him goodbye. And I headed home, sort of sad and feeling bad. So next morning I got up and Donna was coming in from the morning feedings, and I said, well, where do you want me to bury Rusty? And she said, no, he's better. He's still alive. And I thought, Rusty's alive? Oh boy, I was so excited. I rushed over to take a look. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I went in the mudroom. There he is. He's standing in the cage, as big as life, looking me in the eye. And I thought, oh, man, am I so happy. And then I got to thinking, well, maybe I do have the healing touch of Jesus, you know? Isn't that something that we all long for, the healing touch of Jesus? I mean, what I would hope that you can learn during the sermon today is that we can all have that healing touch of Jesus. Let's pray for a moment. Lord, how can I learn to be more like Jesus? How can my touch be like his touch? Teach me the healing touch of Jesus. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be fully acceptable unto thee. Amen. Well, back when I was a practicing doctor, my working day started out with my assistant giving me a schedule, a list of the patients for the day. And I would peruse the list to see who might be coming in to see me. Some names would evoke pleasure and happy anticipation. Others I may not have known or had any real emotional feelings about. There were a few, however, the very sight of which would send a shudder down my spine and an immediate sense of gloom. Mr. Ferguson fell into this category. And there he was on my schedule, George Ferguson, 10:30 a.m., follow-up. I just shook my head and sighed. Well, I kept one eye on the clock, ticking down towards 10:30 as I worked my way through the patient list, knowing that disaster was just around the corner. Mr. Ferguson was a 93-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's who had no close family, and he lived alone in a nursing home nearby. He was afflicted with a squamous cell carcinoma of his left ear, which, due to chronic neglect, had by now become unresectable. And just as the clock was ticking down for me, it was ticking down for Mr. Ferguson as well. It was only a matter of time before the cancer would erode through his temporal bone and enter his brain tissue, ending his life. At 10:25, I could hear them coming in, his nursing home assistant clumsily wheeling him in through the front doors, bumping and clanging their way into the waiting room. He was slumped over in his wheelchair, and his head bobbed as the wobbly wheelchair moved along, and spittle crept down the side of his mouth onto his neck. He was moaning and jabbering in his demented state. Well, the well-dressed ladies and gentlemen in the waiting room shifted in their chairs and peered over their magazines and Wall Street journals to see what all the commotion was about, and then quickly averted their gazes so as not to seem too obvious. Then, like some sort of a grotesque aftershock, a wave of foul, putrid odor filled the room, along with a sense of dread among the other waiting patients. The front desk whispered, "Hurry up, get him back, get him back." And the assistant continued pushing the wobbly wheelchair down our long corridor toward the examination rooms. "Dr. Mashburn, he's here." They didn't really need to call me. I knew he was there. I'd heard him coming in, and by then I'd caught a drift of that terrible odor. I steeled my nerves and put on my mask and gloves and somberly made my way into his exam room. I didn't bother talking to him. I knew he didn't know what was going on. He was slumped over in his wheelchair, and his head was wrapped somewhat unprofessionally with a gauze dressing, which by now had become crusted and stained with old and fresh blood and secretions and disheveled almost to the point of falling off on its own. The nurse handed me some bandage shears. I took a deep breath, knowing what was coming my way, and with a couple of snips, released the nasty bandage and placed it into a red contamination bag to be discreetly disposed of. I could never quite get used to the sight that awaited me under the bandage. His ear, and I call it an ear only because that's the anatomic position in which it sat, had been reduced by the cancer to a puddle of mush with a foul odor that I can't even describe. And the mush was moving. Why was it moving? Because underneath the secretions which had formed a thin brown skin were zillions of little maggots, writhing and wriggling and sipping in the bodily fluids. Oh, how I hate maggots. Hold still, Mr. Ferguson. He reflexly drew away and moaned loudly in his discomfort, and the assistant had to hold his head steady as we worked. We went about the unpleasant task of debriding the dead tissue, old blood and secretion, and yes, maggots. Did I mention those maggots? I hate maggots. After the grim task was done, I redressed the wound with a fresh Xeroform gauze, some fluffs, and a new Curlex wrap, and gladly sent Mr. Ferguson on his way. I'm sure a sigh of relief escaped my lips as he passed by on the wobbly wheelchair. I didn't know where he was going next, and I didn't really care as long as it was out of my office. Now things could get back to normal. I think now, as I look back, what would Jesus have done? How could I have been more like Jesus? And it reminded me of a story in the Bible. I remember the day like it was yesterday. There was excitement in the air. We had heard that he was coming to our village. We had heard about miraculous healings. We had heard that he had followers that was claiming that he was the chosen one, the Messiah. Oh, that our small village would be so lucky as to have him pass through. So many people were filled with anticipation, not the least of which was our temple leader, Jairus, a very wealthy man who was distraught. He had a young daughter in bed, sick. She had been ill for some time. He had hired the best physicians available, but none could cure her disease. He had a glimmer of hope now. When we received word that his boat was approaching our shore, a crowd was already starting to gather to welcome him. Jairus was there too, and he was rushed to the front of the crowd. When Jesus and his disciples stepped ashore, Jairus wasted no time in telling Jesus about his daughter and implored him to make haste to come home, for he feared that his daughter was near death. Well, the crowd was pushing and shoving, trying to get close to him as they slowly made their way along the dusty path leading to the village. Suddenly, I noticed a familiar odor, and my heart sank. She was somewhere near. Oh, why did she have to come on this day, this special day? Everyone knew her. The children were afraid of her and called her names like Old Stinky. The adults just shunned her. She was, after all, unclean. She wasn't allowed in the temple, of course. She had no family that I knew of, no friends. If she showed up at the market, the people scurried to get away from her. You see, she had a disease, a terrible disease, a disgusting disease, undoubtedly God's punishment for past sins. She was small, thin, and hunched over. Her cheeks were hollow, and her complexion was ashen. Her hair was matted and filthy. Her countenance was sad. Her cloak was so disgusting, it's hard to describe with words. There were old brown and red bloodstains crusting all over it. But the worst part, that odor, that terrible stench, it makes me shudder just thinking about it. If it weren't for that odor. I was near him in the crowd, and I prayed that she would keep her distance, but I could tell that stench was getting stronger. I saw the crowd parting behind me as she made her way closer. People were gagging and holding their noses and jeering at her. What was she doing? What was she thinking? Why was she approaching him? He's likely to turn and run as quickly as he can back to his boat to get away from this place once he catches a drift of that smell. Please, woman, just go away. But he didn't turn. He didn't look. I knew he had to smell her. Oh no, I could see her now. She's making her way even closer to him. What in the world is she trying to do? Then I saw something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. She timidly approached him from the rear, reached out her filthy hand. And with just one finger, touched the hem of his garment. Suddenly, a bright light enshrouded her, and I had to squint my eyes. When I blinked again, the light was gone. I rubbed my eyes because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She was standing straight now, her complexion a glowing pink, her hair soft and shiny. The eyes, which were sunken and dull, now had a sparkle. And she was smiling. I'd never seen her smile before. And her cloak, which moments before had been a matted mess of old and new blood and secretions, was now a beautiful robe. A robe as clean and white as fresh fallen snow. And that stench, that awful stench, it was all gone, I tell you. And in its place, I noticed a sweet aroma. I think it smelled a little bit like jasmine. Yes, that's it, jasmine. And then he turned and tenderly looked into her eyes and said, "Your faith has made you whole." It changed my life, I could tell you. You know, Jesus spent his life touching and healing, didn't he? The New Testament is filled with examples of souls sick with physical, mental, and mostly spiritual illnesses that Jesus touched and healed. Did you know that we have the same ability to heal, just like Jesus? The healing touch of Jesus. Our churches at New Market and Valley Fellowship take Jesus' admonition to go out seriously. Go out and touch people. Go out and heal people. When we pass out a bunch of bananas at our produce giveaway, we're not just handing out bananas. We're handing out hope. We're handing out love. We're handing out healing. When we go to a nursing home and put a hand on the shoulder of a resident and rub their neck as we talk to them, we're healing just like Jesus did. When we accompany a single mother to help her with some errands or give her encouragement, we are being just like Jesus. This is not hard. This is not rocket science. Any one of us is capable of healing just like Jesus. Each and every day we come into contact with people who are longing for the healing touch of Jesus. Maybe it's the lady at the checkout counter at the grocery store, or one of your fellow workers, or a church member who's going through a hard time. Maybe one of your family members, maybe even your own spouse. Do you ever wish you could go back in time and do things differently? I know I do. In my mind, I often go back to my patient, Mr. Ferguson, and think about how I could have been more like Jesus with him. How could I have touched him like Jesus would have? When I do, It goes something like this. The assistant handed me my schedule for the morning, and I perused the list, and I saw this name, George Ferguson, 10:30 a.m., follow-up. I took a moment to reflect on Mr. Ferguson's life. Mr. Ferguson had been a teacher at the local high school for many years. He had touched many lives, several generations. He was known and loved by many students over the years. He's 93 years old now. His wife had died some years before, and he lived alone at a local nursing home. He had advanced Alzheimer's disease and wasn't aware of who he was or anyone else around him. His disease had robbed him of his thoughts, but not of his feelings or emotions. His squamous cell cancer of the skin on his left ear started small, but because no one paid attention to it, it had slowly spread to the deeper layers of skin and soft tissue, and by now was tracking down the ear canal on its way toward its inevitable demise. It wouldn't be long now. I kept one eye on the clock as it was ticking down towards 10:30. At 10:25, I went to the front door to meet him and held the door open for his assistant. "Good morning, Mr. Ferguson. Good to see you." I knew he wasn't aware, but my other patients were aware, and they looked over their magazines and Wall Street journals and nodded knowing smiles. I took over the wheelchair as the assistant checked him in, and I pushed Mr. Ferguson back to the exam room, waiting for him. Everything was laid out, neat and ready. My assistant smiled and greeted him, and as we began our task of changing his dressing. When we were finished, I applied a fresh new Curlex gauze wrap around his head as neatly as I could. Then I paused. I looked at the dressing, and for a moment I noticed that it was so clean and white, just like fresh fallen snow. Then I turned to my assistant. "Could you please take a warm rag and wash Mr. Ferguson's face?" She gently wiped his face and neck and cleaned the crusts around his eyes. I noticed that his skin had a healthy pink glow now. Some ointment was applied to his cracked lips, and a comb was run through his thin gray hair. She rubbed his neck for a moment with some lotion. I noticed that his moaning had stopped, and he was sitting peacefully in his chair. I laid my hand on his shoulder. "See you next time, Mr. Ferguson." And as his assistant wheeled him from the room, I glanced at his face, and maybe it was just my imagination, maybe, but I thought I saw a slight smile crack at the corner of his mouth as he went by. The room was tidied up for the next patient, and before she left, the nurse spritzed some air freshener in the room. And as I paused a moment, I noticed that the odor, that stench, that awful stench, was gone completely. And in its place, a sweet aroma. I think it smells a little like jasmine, just a little.